Hey guys, tonight we're travelling back to the American frontier, a vast and untamed land where settlers left behind the comforts of civilization and ventured into the unknown. This was a world of endless forests, open prairies, dangerous rivers, and isolated cabins. Life here promised freedom and opportunity, but it also demanded constant hard work, courage, and sacrifice. So settle in, relax, and let's discover what life was really like on the American frontier. Most settlers arrived with only a few possessions loaded into wagons. Everything they owned had to be carried across long distances. The journey itself was often exhausting. Rough trails, bad weather, broken wagon wheels, and illness could turn a simple trip into a nightmare. When families finally reached their destination, they often found nothing but wilderness stretching in every direction. There were no towns nearby, no stores, and no comfortable homes waiting for them. The first challenge was building shelter before winter arrived. Trees had to be cut down and shaped into logs. Cabins were usually small, simple, and built entirely by hand. Many families lived in unfinished cabins during their first months on the frontier. Rain leaked through roofs, cold winds entered through cracks, and insects seemed to appear everywhere. Daily life revolved around survival. Before sunrise, family members woke to begin their chores. Water had to be carried from wells, streams, or rivers. Firewood had to be collected and chopped. Without fire, there would be no warm food and no protection from the cold. Breakfast was often simple, consisting of cornbread, porridge, or beans. Luxury foods were rare and usually reserved for special occasions. Once breakfast was finished, work consumed nearly every hour of daylight. Men spent much of their time clearing land for farming. Huge trees covered many frontier regions, and removing them required endless effort. Settlers swung heavy axes for hours at a time, cutting down trees that had stood for generations. Even after a tree fell, the stump remained and needed to be removed before crops could be planted. Women worked just as hard. They cooked meals, washed clothes by hand, cared for children, made candles, sewed clothing, and preserved food for winter. Many women also helped in the fields during busy seasons. There was rarely a moment when someone was not working. Children were expected to contribute as soon as they were able. Boys gathered firewood, fetched water, and cared for animals. Girls helped prepare food, clean the cabin, and look after younger siblings. Frontier life taught responsibility at an early age. Farming was never easy. A family's future depended on successful harvests. Yet nature could destroy crops without warning. Droughts dried the soil. Storms flattened fields. Insects devoured plants. Early frosts ruined entire seasons of work. Every year carried uncertainty. Many frontier families never knew whether the next year would bring success or failure. One good harvest could improve their lives, while one bad season could create serious hardship. Because stores were rare, settlers tried to produce nearly everything themselves. Gardens supplied vegetables, chickens provided eggs, and livestock offered meat and milk. Nothing was wasted. Even small scraps of cloth, wood, or metal were saved because they might become useful later. Daily routines rarely changed. The rising sun signalled the beginning of work, and the setting sun marked its end. Without electricity, most activities stopped after dark. Candles and oil lamps provided limited light. but they were valuable and often used sparingly. Many families spent evenings repairing tools, mending clothing, or preparing for the next day's tasks. Education on the frontier was often limited. Some communities built small one-room schoolhouses where children of different ages learned together. However, many children attended school only when farm work allowed, during planting and harvest seasons. Helping the family often took priority over lessons. Teachers faced difficult conditions and usually had few supplies. Travel remained dangerous throughout much of the frontier period. Rivers could suddenly flood. Trails could disappear after storms. And travellers occasionally became lost in unfamiliar territory. A simple trip to another settlement sometimes required carrying food, blankets, and tools in case unexpected problems arose. Despite these dangers, people continued exploring new lands farther west. Stories of fertile soil and opportunity encouraged thousands to leave established towns behind. Native American tribes had lived across these regions for generations before settlers arrived. As more settlers moved westward, conflicts sometimes occurred over land and resources. These encounters shaped much of frontier history and often brought hardship to both settlers and indigenous communities. Life on the frontier demanded resilience unlike almost anything experienced today. Every achievement required effort at a warm home. A successful harvest or a healthy family could not be taken for granted. Yet, many settlers believed the sacrifices were worthwhile because they were building something for the future. They dreamed that their children would enjoy safer and more comfortable lives than they had known. Over time, isolated cabins became farms, farms became villages, and villages grew into towns. Roads improved, businesses opened, and new opportunities appeared. The wilderness slowly changed as communities expanded. Still, the spirit of the frontier remained defined by determination, courage, and the willingness to face uncertainty for countless settlers. Each sunrise brought new challenges, but it also brought new hope. They continued working, building, and pushing forward into the unknown, helping create the foundations of a growing nation that would eventually stretch from coast to coast. As frontier settlements grew, new challenges appeared alongside new opportunities. Small trading posts became important centres of activity where settlers exchanged goods, purchased supplies, and learned the latest news. A trip to town was often a special event, because many families spent weeks or even months living far from other people. These visits allowed settlers to purchase tools, salt, ammunition, fabric, and other necessities that could not easily be produced at home. Blacksmiths were among the most valuable members of any community. They repaired wagon parts, sharpened tools, made horseshoes, and created countless items needed for daily life. Without skilled blacksmiths, many frontier settlements would have struggled to survive. Weather remained one of the greatest dangers. Violent thunderstorms swept across the plains with little warning. Powerful winds damaged buildings and destroyed crops. Lightning strikes occasionally caused devastating fires. In some regions, settlers experienced blizzards, so severe that people became trapped inside their homes for days. During summer extreme, heat made outdoor labour exhausting and dangerous. water sources sometimes dried up, forcing families to travel long distances simply to obtain drinking water. Insects created additional problems. Mosquitoes spread disease, while swarms of grasshoppers could consume entire fields within hours. Frontier families quickly learned that nature could be both generous and unforgiving. Animals played a vital role in everyday life. Horses provided transportation and helped with farming. Oxen pulled heavy wagons across rough terrain. Cows supplied milk, while chickens produced eggs. Losing even a single animal could create serious difficulties for a family already living close to survival. Because of this, settlers devoted considerable time to caring for their livestock. Safety was never guaranteed. Cabins were often built from wood, making fire a constant threat. A single accident near an open flame could destroy a family's home and possessions. Many settlers kept buckets of water nearby whenever fires burned inside their cabins. Even simple tasks carried risks. Falling trees, runaway horses, and accidents with tools caused injuries that could change lives forever. Yet despite these dangers, many people remained optimistic. They believed they were creating opportunities unavailable elsewhere. Land ownership represented freedom and independence for countless frontier settlers. Every fence built, every field planted, and every cabin completed brought them closer to the future they imagined. As years passed, trails became roads. Isolated settlements became thriving communities, and regions once considered wilderness slowly transformed into part of a growing nation. The frontier was never easy, but for those willing to endure its hardships, it offered the chance to build a new life through determination, patience, and relentless hard work. Not everyone who travelled to the frontier succeeded. Some families arrived with high hopes only to discover that frontier life was far more difficult than they had imagined. Crops sometimes failed year after year. Illness could strike without warning. A broken wagon, a harsh winter, or the loss of livestock could push a family into poverty. Some settlers eventually abandoned their land and returned east, while others packed their belongings and searched for better opportunities elsewhere. Those who remained learned the value of persistence. Success often came slowly and required years of sacrifice. As more settlers moved westward, transportation gradually improved. New roads connected distant communities. Riverboats carried goods along major waterways, making trade easier than before. Eventually, railroads began transforming the frontier. Areas that once felt isolated suddenly became connected to larger towns and cities. Supplies arrived more quickly, and settlers gained access to products that had once been difficult or impossible to obtain. The arrival of the railroad changed daily life in countless ways. Farmers could sell crops farther from home. Merchants could stock more goods. And travellers could reach destinations in days instead of weeks. Entire towns appeared along railway routes, attracting new residents and businesses. However, many frontier families still lived far from these developments and continued relying primarily on their own labour and resourcefulness. Entertainment remained simple compared to modern standards. There were no televisions, smartphones, or movie theatres. Instead, people created their own enjoyment. Storytelling remained popular, especially during long evenings that families shared tales of adventure, local legends, and memorable experiences. From there, journeys west. Community gatherings. often featured music, dancing, games, and friendly competitions. These events helped strengthen relationships among neighbours and offered welcome breaks from demanding routines. Children found ways to have fun despite limited toys and resources. They explored nearby forests, swam in rivers, plays, and used their imaginations to create adventures. Yet even while playing, many children understood that responsibilities came first. Helping the family survive was an important part of growing up on the frontier. Over time, frontier communities developed schools, churches, businesses, and local governments. What had once been scattered cabins, surrounded by wilderness, gradually became organised settlements. New generations grew up knowing lives that were often safer and more comfortable than those of their parents. Still, stories of the early days remained important. Older settlers remembered the years of hardship, the endless work, and the uncertainty they had faced when they first arrived. They remembered nights when wolves howled beyond the cabin walls, winters that seemed endless, and long days spent transforming wilderness into farmland. For many settlers, the frontier was not just a place to live, but a constant test of character. Every day presented new problems that required practical solutions. If a roof leaked during a storm, it had to be repaired immediately. If an animal became sick, the family risked losing an important source of food or income. If crops failed, there was often no government assistance or nearby store to provide relief. People learned to adapt because survival depended on it. Resourcefulness became one of the most valuable skills a settler could possess. Nothing useful was thrown away. Broken tools were repaired repeatedly. Old clothing was patched and reused until it could no longer hold together. Even animal hides, bones, and scraps of wood found practical purposes around the homestead. Frontier families understood that wasting resources could create serious problems later. Water was another constant concern. Some settlements were fortunate enough to be located near rivers or streams, while others depended on wells that required significant effort to dig and maintain. During dry seasons, access to clean water became even more important. Families carefully managed their supplies because they never knew when conditions might become difficult. Frontier women carried enormous responsibilities. In addition to managing households, many helped care for gardens, livestock, and crops. They often spent hours preparing meals from basic ingredients, preserving food for winter, and making clothing by hand. Their work was physically demanding and essential to the survival of the family. Without their efforts, many homesteads would not have succeeded. Men frequently spent long days performing heavy labour. They built fences, cleared fields, hunted game, repaired wagons, and constructed new buildings. Their work required strength, endurance, and patience. Many settlers developed impressive practical skills simply because there was no one else available to perform these tasks. Children grew up watching their parents work tirelessly and quickly learned similar habits. Responsibility arrived early on the frontier. A young child might help gather eggs, feed animals, or carry water. As they grew older, their duties increased. By their teenage years, many frontier children possess skills that modern adults might never learn. They could ride horses, use tools, care for livestock, and contribute meaningfully to family survival. As settlements expanded, local traditions began to emerge. Annual celebrations, fairs, and community events brought people together. These gatherings provided opportunities to trade goods, share news, and strengthen friendships. They also reminded settlers that despite the hardships of frontier life, they were not alone. Together, they were building communities where future generations could thrive. Slowly but surely, the frontier changed. Areas once dominated by wilderness became productive farmland. As the years passed, many settlers began to understand that surviving on the frontier required more than strength alone. Patience was equally important. Progress came slowly, a field that seemed impossible to clear during the first year might become productive farmland after several seasons of effort. A tiny cabin built for immediate shelter could eventually be expanded into a comfortable family home. Frontier life rewarded those who were willing to think long-term and work steadily toward their goals. One of the greatest sources of pride for settlers was land ownership. In many places, owning land had once been an impossible dream. On the frontier, however, families had the opportunity to build something that belonged to them. Every tree removed, every fence constructed, and every crop harvested represented another step toward a more secure future. This sense of ownership motivated countless people to endure hardships that might otherwise have seemed unbearable. Frontier communities also relied heavily on trust, because neighbours often depended on one another during emergencies. Honesty and cooperation were highly valued. If a family lost a barn to fire, nearby settlers frequently helped rebuild it. If illness prevented someone from harvesting crops, neighbours might assist with the work. These acts of cooperation strengthened communities and improved everyone's chances of survival. At the same time, frontier life could be emotionally difficult. Many settlers left behind relatives and friends when they moved west. Some never saw their former homes again. Special occasions such as holidays and family celebrations often reminded people of those they had left behind. Loneliness was a challenge that rarely appeared in official records but was experienced by countless settlers throughout the frontier years. The natural world remained a constant presence in everyday life. Settlers paid close attention to changing weather patterns, animal behaviour, and seasonal cycles. Their success often depended on understanding the environment around them. A sudden drop in temperature, unusual bird migrations, or changes in river levels could provide valuable warnings about upcoming conditions. Unlike modern life, where technology solves many problems, frontier families depended largely on observation and experience. Food preservation was another crucial skill. During harvest season, families worked tirelessly to prepare for winter. Fruits and vegetables were dried or stored. Meat was salted or smoked. Every available resource was carefully managed because nobody could predict exactly how severe the coming winter might be. A well-prepared family entered winter with confidence, while a poorly prepared one faced significant risk. As children grew into adults, many established their own farms nearby or joined new waves of settlers moving farther west. In this way, the frontier continually expanded. By the middle of the 19th century, Frontier life had become a symbol of both hardship and opportunity. Travellers arriving from the eastern states were often shocked by the vastness of the landscape. Days could pass without seeing a large town. Endless grasslands stretched to the horizon, interrupted only by rivers, forests, and distant hills. For newcomers, the scale of the frontier felt almost unimaginable. Many families travelled in wagon trains for safety. These groups moved slowly across difficult terrain, sometimes covering only a few miles each day. Rivers were among the greatest obstacles. Crossing them could be dangerous, especially during periods of heavy rain. Wagons occasionally overturned, supplies were lost, and some travellers never reached their destinations. Despite these dangers, thousands continued their journeys, driven by the hope of a better future. Once settled, families spent years improving their homesteads. Trees were planted for shade and fruit. Additional rooms were added to cabins. Barns, wells, and fences gradually appeared. What began as a rough settlement slowly developed into a permanent home. Each improvement represented countless hours of labour and determination. Frontier merchants played an important role in local economies. General stores supplied items that families could not easily produce themselves. Coffee, sugar, nails, tools, fabric, and other goods often arrived after long journeys from distant cities. Because transportation was expensive, many products cost more than settlers would have liked. As a result, people learned to live with very little and make the most of what they had. Seasonal changes influenced every aspect of life. Spring brought optimism as new crops were planted. Summer demanded long hours in the fields. Autumn became a race to gather harvests before cold weather arrived. Winter encouraged families to remain close to home, focusing on repairs, maintenance, and preparation for the following year. This cycle repeated again and again, shaping the rhythm of frontier existence. Many settlers measured time not by calendars but by seasons and harvests. Years of experience taught them when to plant, when to hunt, and when to prepare for changing weather. Their knowledge was practical and often passed from one generation to the next. Through these lessons, children learned how to survive in environments that could be both beautiful and unforgiving, even as towns expanded and transportation improved. The memory of the early frontier remained strong. Stories of difficult journeys, harsh winters, dangerous storms, and remarkable perseverance became part of local history. Around fireplaces and dinner tables, older settlers shared memories of the days when the land was still wild and uncertain. These stories helped preserve the experiences of those who had transformed wilderness into thriving communities. As settlements became larger, frontier life slowly began to change. New businesses opened, schools welcomed more students, and churches became important centres of community life. Yet even as progress arrived, many of the challenges that had defined frontier living remained. Roads were often rough and difficult to travel, especially after storms. A journey of only a few miles could take hours. During heavy rains, wagons became stuck in deep mud, forcing travellers to wait for conditions to improve. For many settlers, patience was simply part of everyday life. Markets and trade gradually expanded as more people arrived. Farmers who once grew crops only for their own families began selling surplus food to nearby towns. Livestock became an important source of income. Some settlers discovered opportunities in logging, trapping, or transporting goods between communities. These activities helped create local economies and allowed families to earn money in addition to producing their own necessities. Frontier towns often developed unique personalities. Some were quiet farming communities where neighbours knew one another well. Others became busy centres of trade filled with travellers, merchants and craftsmen. No matter their size, most towns depended heavily on cooperation. Everyone understood that life could become difficult very quickly if people stopped helping one another. Nature continued to shape daily existence in powerful ways. Floods occasionally swept through river valleys, damaging homes and destroying crops. Droughts left fields dry and unproductive. Harsh winters tested food supplies and endurance. Unlike today, settlers could not simply visit a store whenever problems arose. They needed to prepare carefully and remain adaptable. This constant uncertainty taught valuable lessons about resilience and self-reliance. For many families, education represented hope for the future. Parents who had spent their lives performing physically demanding labour often dreamed of greater opportunities for their children. Even simple schools were viewed as important investments in the next generation. Teachers frequently worked with limited resources, but they played a significant role in helping communities grow and develop. As decades passed, more people arrived from different backgrounds and regions. They brought new traditions, skills, and ideas. Frontier communities became places where cultures mixed and influenced one another. New foods, building techniques, and customs spread throughout settlements, creating a diverse and constantly changing society. Despite increasing development, many older settlers remembered a time when the frontier felt truly wild. They remembered building their first cabins, clearing forests by hand, and surviving winters with limited supplies. They recalled nights when the nearest neighbour lived miles away and journeys into town required an entire day. These memories became treasured stories shared with children and grandchildren. For many people, the frontier represented a chance to start over. Some settlers arrived with very little money, hoping that hard work would provide opportunities unavailable elsewhere. Others came seeking adventure, freedom, or land of their own. Whatever their reasons, nearly everyone discovered that frontier life demanded sacrifices. Comfort was rare, and success required years of effort. Still, thousands continued arriving, believing that the rewards would eventually outweigh the hardships. As communities expanded, local traditions became increasingly important. Annual fairs, harvest festivals, and community gatherings offered opportunities for people to relax after months of labour. Farmers displayed their best crops and livestock. Families shared food, stories, and music. Children played games while adults discussed weather, crops, and local events. These celebrations strengthened community bonds and reminded settlers that they were part of something larger than their individual struggles. Frontier justice was often simple and practical. In many areas, formal law enforcement was limited or non-existent. Communities frequently handled disputes themselves, relying on respected local leaders to help resolve conflicts. Reputation mattered greatly. A person known for honesty and hard work earned trust, while someone considered unreliable could quickly find themselves isolated. because neighbours depended on one another. Maintaining good relationships was often essential. The frontier also attracted inventors, entrepreneurs and skilled craftsmen. People constantly searched for better ways to perform difficult tasks. New farming tools improved productivity. Stronger wagons made travel easier. Better building techniques helped families create more durable homes. Small innovations could significantly improve daily life and reduce some of the hardships settlers faced. Wildlife remained a constant presence even as settlements grew. Herds of deer moved through forests and grasslands. Birds filled the skies during migration. Seasons, rivers, provided fish and supported local ecosystems. Many settlers developed a deep appreciation for the natural world because their survival depended on understanding it. They learned which plants could be used for food, where animals could be found, and how changing weather patterns affected daily activities. Evenings often brought a sense of peace after long days of work as the sun disappeared beyond the horizon. Families gathered inside their homes. The glow of a fireplace provided warmth and light. Stories passed from one generation to the next. Parents spoke about difficult journeys, memorable adventures, and lessons learned through experience. Children listened carefully, imagining challenges their families had overcome. These stories helped preserve frontier traditions and values. Over time, transportation networks continued improving. More roads appeared, towns became better connected, and goods travelled greater distances. As the frontier continued expanding westward, stories of opportunity spread across the country. Newspapers printed accounts of fertile farmland, new settlements, and families finding success in distant territories. These stories inspired many people to leave crowded towns and cities behind. Some sold nearly everything they owned to finance the journey. Others joined relatives who had already settled farther west. The decision was never easy because leaving meant saying goodbye to familiar places and loved ones, often forever. For those who made the journey, uncertainty became a constant companion. No one could predict exactly what challenges waited ahead. A family might travel hundreds of miles only to discover rocky soil, limited water, or harsh weather conditions. Yet many settlers refused to give up. They adapted, learned from experience, and gradually found ways to survive. Their determination became one of the defining characteristics of frontier life. The frontier also encouraged innovation. When settlers lacked resources, they invented creative solutions. Broken equipment was repaired using whatever materials were available. Homes were constructed from local resources rather than imported supplies. Every challenge became an opportunity to develop new skills. This practical approach helped many families succeed despite difficult circumstances. Community cooperation remained essential. During harvest season, neighbours often worked together to gather crops before storms could destroy them. If a family experienced illness or injury, others frequently provided assistance. These acts of kindness strengthened communities and increased everyone's chances of survival. Frontier settlers understood that no matter how independent they wished to be, there were times when everyone needed help. The landscape itself left a lasting impression on those who lived there. Vast prairies stretched endlessly beneath open skies. Rivers carved paths through forests and valleys. Mountains stood in the distance, appearing both beautiful and intimidating. Many settlers spoke about the sense of freedom they felt while living in such enormous spaces. At the same time, that same wilderness could feel lonely and overwhelming. Nature constantly reminded people of its power. Strong winds, severe storms, and changing seasons shaped daily decisions. As years passed, children born on the frontier grew into adults who knew no other way of life. They inherited farms, businesses, and traditions created by their parents. Unlike the first settlers, they often enjoyed greater stability and more established communities. Schools improved, roads expanded, and trade increased. Life remained challenging, but it gradually became more predictable than it had been during the earliest years of settlement. Many older pioneers looked back with pride on everything they had accomplished. They remembered arriving in places where little existed beyond wilderness. Even as the frontier became more settled, daily life remained filled with hard work. Most people could not afford to be idle. From sunrise until sunset, tasks demanded attention. Fences needed repairs. Animals required care. Crops had to be planted or harvested. And homes constantly needed maintenance. A single neglected problem could become much larger if left unresolved. Because labour was so important, frontier families developed strong habits of discipline and responsibility. Many settlers measured wealth differently than people do today. A healthy horse, a productive field, Ostrong, barn, or a successful harvest often mattered more than money itself. Resources that could directly support survival were considered extremely valuable. Families took pride in their ability to provide for themselves and overcome difficulties through their own efforts. This sense of independence became a defining part of frontier culture. The changing seasons continued to shape every aspect of life. Spring brought hope as farmers prepared fields and planted seeds. Summer meant long days of work beneath the hot sun. Autumn was one of the busiest times of the year, because crops had to be gathered before cold weather arrived. Winter encouraged people to slow down slightly, though chores never completely disappeared. Livestock still needed care. Firewood still needed cutting. And homes still required attention. For children, the frontier was both challenging and exciting. They learned practical skills from an early age and often enjoyed freedoms that were difficult to find in crowded cities. Forests, rivers, and open fields became places of exploration and adventure. Yet they also understood the importance of responsibility. Many children contributed significantly to the success of their families and gained valuable experience through daily work. As transportation improved and new settlers continued arriving, some frontier towns experienced rapid growth. Businesses expanded, newspapers appeared, and local governments became more organised. What had once been isolated, settlements gradually developed into established communities with stronger connections to the rest of the country. Still, many residents remembered the difficult years when survival had been uncertain and every achievement required extraordinary effort. The frontier spirit influenced people's attitudes long after conditions improved. Individuals who had overcome years of hardship often developed confidence in their ability to face future challenges. They understood that persistence could accomplish remarkable things. This belief was passed down through stories, traditions, and personal example. New generations grew up hearing about dangerous journeys, harsh winters, failed crops, and eventual success. These stories became part of family history and community identity. Looking across the frontier at sunset, settlers could often see evidence of their hard work everywhere. As the 19th century moved forward, the frontier slowly began to disappear. But many people living there did not realize they were witnessing the end of an era. To them, life continued much as it always had. Fields still needed planting, livestock still needed care, and families still depended on their own labour to survive. Yet beyond the horizon, change was coming. Railroads stretched farther across the continent each year, connecting once isolated settlements to growing cities. News travelled faster, goods became easier to obtain, and distant communities were no longer quite as remote as they had once been. For older settlers, these changes often felt remarkable. Many remembered arriving when there were no roads, no stores, and few neighbours. They remembered sleeping beside campfires during long journeys and building cabins from freshly cut logs. Now they watched towns grow around them. Children who had once played in wilderness clearings were becoming merchants, teachers, farmers, and community leaders. The frontier they had known was changing into something new. Despite these developments, the values learned through frontier life remained strong. Hard work was respected. Self-reliance was admired. People understood the importance of perseverance because they had experienced firsthand how difficult survival could be. These values influenced not only individuals but entire communities. They shaped local traditions, family expectations, and the way people approached challenges. Many settlers believed that determination could overcome almost any obstacle because they had spent years proving it to themselves. The landscape also continued changing. Forests gave way to farmland. New buildings appeared where open grasslands had once stretched uninterrupted for miles. Bridges crossed rivers that had once been dangerous barriers. Trails used by pioneers gradually became established roads. Every improvement represented countless hours of effort from people determined to create better lives. Yet traces of the old frontier remained visible. Remote cabins still stood in isolated locations. Hunters and trappers still travelled through wilderness regions. Some families continued living much as earlier settlers had, relying heavily on their own skills and resources. The transition from frontier to settled society happened gradually, rather than all at once. Memories played an important role in preserving frontier history. Around fireplaces and dinner tables, older generations shared stories about difficult journeys, severe winters, dangerous storms, and unexpected adventures. Children listened with fascination, imagining a world that seemed far different from their own. These stories helped keep the spirit of the frontier alive even as conditions changed. They reminded younger generations of the sacrifices that had helped build their communities. Looking back, many pioneers felt pride in what they had accomplished. Even after towns became larger and life grew more comfortable, many people still remembered the lessons learned on the frontier. Parents taught their children the importance of hard work, honesty, and determination. They knew from experience that success rarely came easily. Every fence they built, every crop they harvested, and every home they constructed had required patience and effort. Those lessons became part of family traditions and were passed down from one generation to the next. Frontier life also created a strong sense of appreciation for simple things. A good harvest, healthy livestock, a warm fire on a cold night, or a safe journey home were reasons to be grateful. People understood how quickly circumstances could change. A storm could destroy months of work, while an illness could affect an entire family. Because of this, many settlers learned not to take everyday comforts for granted. As communities expanded, local economies became more diverse. Some residents remained farmers, while others became merchants, teachers, blacksmiths, carpenters, or doctors. New opportunities appeared as towns grew. Children who once expected to spend their lives farming sometimes pursued different careers, helping communities become more connected and prosperous. Yet no matter how much progress occurred, the memory of the frontier remained woven into daily life. Travellers visiting these communities often noticed the independent spirit of the people who lived there. Settlers had spent years solving problems with limited resources. They learned to rely on their own abilities and adapt to changing conditions. This mindset remained even after roads improved and supplies became easier to obtain. People continued valuing practical skills and personal responsibility because those qualities had helped them survive difficult times. Nature still influenced life in important ways. Farmers watched the weather closely and planned their work around seasonal changes. Rivers remained important for transportation and trade. Forests provided timber for construction and fuel for heating. The natural world was no longer as overwhelming as it had been during the earliest years of settlement, but it still played a major role in shaping everyday decisions. Many frontier settlers lived long enough to witness extraordinary transformations. Places that had once contained only a few cabins became thriving towns. Trails became roads, and roads eventually connected entire regions. New technologies changed how people travelled, communicated, and conducted business. To those who remembered the earliest days, these developments seemed almost unbelievable. Yet they also knew that none of it would have been possible without the sacrifices made by earlier pioneers. The frontier was more than a physical place. It represented a way of life built upon courage, resilience, and hope. People arrived with dreams of a better future and worked tirelessly to make those dreams reality. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about frontier life was the courage it required. Every major decision carried risk. Leaving an established community to travel into unfamiliar territory meant stepping into the unknown. There were no guarantees of success. Families could spend months travelling only to face unexpected hardships upon arrival. Yet thousands of settlers accepted those risks because they believed the possibility of a better future was worth the struggle. Their courage helped shape entire regions of the country. Life on the frontier also taught people how to endure disappointment. Crops failed, storms damaged property, and plans sometimes collapsed despite months of effort. Many settlers experienced setbacks that would have caused others to quit. Instead, they rebuilt, replanted, and tried again. This ability to recover from failure became one of the defining characteristics of frontier communities. Persistence often mattered more than immediate success. The frontier encouraged people to develop a deep understanding of their surroundings. Settlers learned which areas provided fertile soil, where fresh water could be found, and how weather patterns affected crops and livestock. Survival depended on observation and experience. Over time, many pioneers gained knowledge that allowed them to thrive in environments that initially seemed harsh and unforgiving. Their relationship with the land became an important part of daily life. Family bonds were strengthened through shared challenges. Parents, children, and relatives worked together toward common goals. Every member of the household contributed in some way. Success belonged to the entire family, not just one individual. This cooperation created strong relationships and taught younger generations the value of responsibility and teamwork. Even during difficult periods, settlers found reasons to remain hopeful. A successful harvest, the completion of a new barn, or the arrival of new neighbours could bring excitement and optimism. Small achievements often felt significant because they represented progress earned through hard work. These moments reminded people that their efforts were producing results and helping build a more stable future. As settlements expanded, frontier residents began creating traditions unique to their communities. Local celebrations, fairs, and gatherings became important events that brought people together. These occasions offered opportunities to share experiences, exchange ideas, and strengthen friendships. Community life helped reduce feelings of isolation and created a sense of belonging. Although the frontier could be a lonely place, people discovered ways to support one another and build meaningful connections. The passing years brought change, but they also brought evidence of accomplishment. Fields became productive farms. Temporary shelters became permanent homes. Small settlements developed into thriving towns. One of the greatest challenges frontier settlers faced was uncertainty. Today, many people can plan weeks or months ahead with reasonable confidence. But frontier families often had no idea what the next season might bring. A year of good weather could fill barns with grain and provide enough food to last through winter. A year of drought, disease, or storms could threaten everything they had worked to build. Because of this uncertainty, settlers learned to prepare whenever possible. They stored food, repaired tools, and worked constantly to improve their chances of surviving difficult times. The frontier also demanded patience. Progress rarely happened quickly. A newly arrived family might spend years turning a patch of wilderness into a successful farm. Trees had to be removed, fields prepared, buildings constructed, and livestock raised. Every improvement required time and effort. Yet settlers understood that lasting success could not be achieved overnight. They focused on small accomplishments, knowing that each step brought them closer to their goals. Many pioneers developed a strong sense of pride in their work. When they looked across a field they had cleared themselves or stood inside a home they had built with their own hands, they saw proof of their determination. These achievements carried special meaning because they represented countless hours of labour. Nothing came easily on the frontier, which made success feel even more valuable. The frontier was also a place of constant learning. New settlers quickly discovered that experience was often the best teacher. Mistakes could be costly, but they provided important lessons. Families learned which crops grew best in their area, how to prepare for harsh winters, and how to manage limited resources. Over time, this knowledge made survival easier and helped communities become more stable. Relationships between neighbours remained extremely important. In many places, help could not be found quickly during emergencies. If a storm damaged a barn or illness affected a family, nearby settlers were often the first and only source of assistance. Acts of cooperation became common because everyone understood that one day they might need help themselves. These connections created strong communities built on trust and mutual support. Children raised on the frontier witnessed these values every day. They saw adults working hard, solving problems, and helping one another through difficult situations. As they grew older, they carried those lessons into their own lives. Many would eventually establish farms and families of their own, continuing traditions that had begun with the earliest pioneers. In this way, frontier values passed from one generation to the next. As transportation improved and more settlers arrived, some people began realizing that the frontier was slowly changing forever. Areas that once felt remote became increasingly connected to the rest of the country. For many frontier families, faith and hope played an important role in daily life. When crops failed, when storms destroyed property, or when illness spread through a community, people often relied on their beliefs to remain strong. Life could be unpredictable and sometimes heartbreaking. Children did not always survive to adulthood. Accidents occurred frequently, and many families experienced loss. Yet despite these hardships, settlers continued moving forward. They believed that tomorrow could be better than today, and that belief helped them endure some of the most difficult moments of frontier life. The natural beauty of the frontier also left lasting memories. Early in the morning, settlers watched sunlight spread across endless prairies. At night, the sky filled with more stars than many people had ever seen before. Rivers reflected the colours of sunset, and forests changed dramatically with the seasons. Although nature could be dangerous, it could also be breathtakingly beautiful. Many pioneers developed a deep respect for the landscapes around them because they spent so much of their lives working within them. Hunting trips often lasted 4 days. Men sometimes travelled deep into forests or across open plains searching for game. These journeys required patience and skill. A successful hunt could provide valuable food for an entire family, while an unsuccessful one meant returning home empty-handed. Hunting was not merely recreation on the frontier. It was often an important part of survival. Women frequently became the heart of frontier households. They managed countless responsibilities every day, often without recognition. Beyond cooking and cleaning, many cared for gardens, livestock, and children while also helping with harvests and other demanding tasks. Their strength and determination were essential to the success of frontier communities. Without their efforts, many settlements would not have survived the challenges of frontier life. As towns grew larger, opportunities slowly increased. General stores offered more goods, schools became more common, and local businesses created new ways for families to earn income. What had once been isolated settlements gradually became connected to broader networks of trade and communication. Letters arrived more frequently. Travellers brought news from distant places, and communities felt less alone than they had during earlier years. Still, Older settlers often remembered the frontier's earliest days with a mixture of pride and nostalgia. They remembered arriving in a land where almost everything had to be built from the ground up. They remembered the excitement of possibility, the fear of uncertainty, and the satisfaction of overcoming obstacles. Those experiences shaped who they became and influenced the communities they helped create. The frontier was more than a place. It was a way of life that demanded resilience and rewarded determination. As the frontier era drew closer to its end, many pioneers found themselves reflecting on the lives they had built. When they first arrived, they had faced uncertainty at every turn. There were no guarantees of success, only possibilities. Yet through years of labour, sacrifice and determination, they had transformed unfamiliar land into thriving communities. What once seemed impossible had gradually become reality. Farms produced reliable harvests. Towns supported growing populations. And families enjoyed opportunities that earlier generations could scarcely imagine. The passage of time brought noticeable changes to everyday life. New technologies reduced some of the hardships pioneers had endured. Better tools made farming more efficient. Improved transportation shortened journeys that once required weeks. Communication became faster, allowing people to remain connected with distant friends and relatives. For younger generations, these improvements seemed normal. For older settlers, however, they were reminders of how dramatically the frontier had changed. Many pioneers never considered themselves heroes. They viewed their efforts simply as necessary work. They woke before sunrise, completed their chores, solved problems, and focused on providing for their families. Yet their accomplishments were extraordinary. They built homes where none existed, established farms in difficult environments, and helped create communities that continued growing long after they were gone. Their persistence shaped the future in ways they could never fully predict. Even after the frontier became more settled, stories from earlier years remained popular. Children listened as grandparents described dangerous river crossings, severe winters, and long wagon journeys. These stories were often filled with challenges, but they also contained moments of courage, humour, and hope. Through storytelling, the experiences of the frontier continued influencing new generations. The American frontier eventually became part of history, but its impact never disappeared. The values developed during that era, self-reliance, resilience, hard work, and optimism, continued shaping communities across the country. People admired pioneers not because their lives were easy, but because they persevered despite enormous difficulties. They faced uncertainty with determination and built futures from little more than effort and belief. As evening settles across the frontier one final time, the sounds of daily work begin to fade. Smoke rises from cabin chimneys. Horses rest in their barns. Families gather inside their homes, sharing meals and stories after another long day. Beyond the windows, the vast landscape stretches quietly beneath the stars. For generations of settlers, this land represented challenge, opportunity, and hope. Their journey was never simple, but through courage and perseverance, they left behind a legacy that would endure long after the frontier itself had passed into memory. And so, as the years continued to pass, the frontier slowly became less of a wilderness and more of a home. the endless forests were crossed by roads. Small settlements became towns, and towns eventually grew into cities. What had once seemed like the edge of the known world was now part of everyday life. Yet behind every road, every farm, and every community stood the memories of the people who had arrived with little more than hope and determination. Many pioneers never became wealthy. They never achieved fame, and history books rarely recorded their names. Yet their lives mattered. They were the farmers who cleared the land, the mothers who held families together during difficult winters, the children who grew up working beside their parents, and the neighbours who helped one another when times became hard. They were ordinary people who faced extraordinary challenges. The frontier taught lessons that could not be learned in comfort. It taught patience when progress seemed slow. It taught courage when fear would have been easier. It taught gratitude for simple things: a warm meal, a successful harvest, a safe journey home, or the sight of loved ones gathered around a fire at the end of a long day. These small moments often meant more than great riches because they had been earned through effort and sacrifice. As the old pioneers grew older, they watched younger generations inherit the world they had helped create. Children who once played outside rough log cabins became adults living in growing towns. Grandchildren listened with fascination to stories of wagon journeys, wilderness trails, and the first difficult years of settlement. To them, those stories sounded almost unbelievable, like tales from another age. Yet for the pioneers, they were simply memories of life as it had been. The American frontier was never only about land. It was about people. It was about dreams carried across great distances. It was about families willing to leave behind the familiar and face an uncertain future. It was about perseverance during failure, hope during hardship, and determination when giving up would have been easier. These qualities shaped the frontier and, in many ways, shaped the nation that followed. Now the sun is beginning to set beyond the distant horizon. The fields grow quiet. The day's work is finally finished. A cool breeze moves through the tall grass as evening settles across the land. Somewhere in the distance, a horse shifts in its stable. A lantern glows softly inside a farmhouse window. Families gather together, sharing stories, laughter, and the comfort of knowing they have made it through another day. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the American frontier. Now, as the stars slowly appear above the quiet prairie and the night grows peaceful, it's time to rest. Close your eyes, let the sounds of the frontier fade into the distance, and drift gently into sleep. Good night.